started. So welcome to everybody. I kind of did a roll call, huh? Good to see everybody here today, and it's nice and chilly out, and we'd love to have some of our staff on here with us. I see Carla Wright. Carla's waving to us. She is new to our team. This is her second week, and it's always good when they come back for the second week. So thank you for that, Carla. Carla is in our finance department, and she is here from Louisville. Oh, see, I said it right.
Yes, Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, if you're not from there, if you're from there, it's Louisville. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, so she's amazing. Impressive background in accounting, working in the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector. So a great asset to our finance team. Carla, welcome. So glad you could dial in this morning. And then I think all of you probably see Pamela and Missy and Bonnie and Stephanie, Joyce, there's Joyce and Linda and Lindsay. So we've got the team and Sue Kaplan, we call her Cap. Okay, so I'll get moving here. So we really enjoy these coffees. They're always just such a wonderful thing to look forward to. And I always learn so much at every single coffee. We're really, really fortunate to have such loyal and devoted friends in the professional sector, whether it's a physician or an investment person or an attorney or a CPA or any of those that we've been talking about. So Dave, thanks for making time this morning. Yes, as usual, you'll be muted during the presentation just so we don't get the feedback. But if you do have a question, and Dave likes to make this conversational, so he will pause at times, or if you have a question or you need clarification on something that he has said, certainly, you can either raise your hand or put a message in the chat box, and Joyce will unmute you so that you can ask Dave the question. So today we're talking about IRAs, individual retirement accounts, and there's been some changes recently, and it just seems to be that a lot of people are hungry for this information about how secure is your IRA. I was with a gentleman the other day who was talking about how robust his IRA had become because of the market, and his daughter was going to do well to inherit that. So we walked down the path of what you're about to hear Dave talk about today. So it's important that you ask the questions of him on the IRA landscape as you're going through. And Dave will give you a little bit of history on IRAs, but mostly talk about what it means today and how it can be a very simple way with the gain in these portfolios, rather than taking the income or taking the income which we tax to you. That's a great time to consider being charitable to your favorite charity. And we would hope that that might be us. So, but we know that all of you have other charities as well. So again, Dave Eastman is our very special guest today. Dave Eastman is from Eastman Trust, and he's going to explain what's happening with the recent changes on the IRAs. Whether you've attended Dave's presentation before, there's always updates that he shares and opportunities to learn more, especially as the year end approaches. And so Dave has, help me advance. So Dave has been on the Sun Health Foundation Board of Trustees until recently. Then he stepped away. He stepped away from a large firm and started his own, so that's taking a lot of his time. He is a member of the Wealth Council and also has a very active family. I think 4 teenagers who are all in sports. So he and his wife keep running on that. Dave is a member of our Council of Professional Advisors, and that has been tremendously helpful for us as well. And he often speaks on estate planning issues and topics. So we're fortunate to have Dave with us today. Dave, it is my great pleasure to mute me and unmute you. So Dave, you're on.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate it. Thank you for that introduction. It's great to be with everybody today. I'm not sure how many were on our Zoom call. I think we did this back in July. It was June, on the same topic. So hopefully I don't bore you today. My goal is to try to keep you awake as long as I possibly can as we talk about taxes and fun things like that. So hopefully I can accomplish my job before I put you to sleep. But happy Thanksgiving. Hope everybody has an enjoyable Thanksgiving coming up, and eats lots of turkey and stays safe and healthy. So what we're going to do is we're going to share our whiteboard with everybody. But before we do that, I'm going to have Elisa go back to just the screen before you pop this up. I can see everybody, or most everybody. By a raise of hands, because I can see all of you here on my screen. By a raise of hands, how many of you have an IRA, 401k, 403b, some type of a retirement account? Raise your hand if you have some type of retirement account. Okay, that's what I figured, almost everybody. And how many of you, raise your hand, how many of you are philanthropically minded? I hope everybody raises their hand real high because you're on this Coffee with Gina, Sun Health. So I'm guessing a lot of you like to make charitable contributions. Okay, and how many of you have an estate plan in place right now? How many have a trust, a will, some powers of attorney, something? Okay, almost all of you. Okay. Well, our goal today is to talk about the Secure Act and how has the Secure Act changed the landscape when it comes to retirement accounts. How do we best now plan with our retirement accounts? Most of us, if not the largest asset, one of the largest assets that makes up our estate, more oftentimes than not with our clients, is the retirement account. And that's because they're amazing financial planning vehicles. We put the money that we've earned into these vehicles, income tax deferred, and they grow income tax deferred until we have to start taking money out at a certain age. So that lets the money just continue to compound and grow and grow and grow. To the tune of, in America today, over $29 trillion are in retirement accounts. So all of us that raised our hand that says we have retirement accounts, we're contributing to that $29 trillion amount. And it keeps just growing and growing, getting bigger and bigger. And before we jump into the Secure Act, a couple of things. Number one is we're going to leave lots of time at the end for questions. Okay, so there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. Hopefully I do a good enough job where you have no questions at the end and it's, Dave, that was amazing. I don't even have anything to ask because you said it all very well and made it easy to understand. But if there are questions, we can save some time at the end for that. But before we jump in and show you our whiteboard and diagram some stuff, I'm more of a visual person. So if I can see it, I understand it better. It makes more sense to me. But before we jump into that, just kind of a quick history of retirement accounts and how we got to the Secure Act and why the Secure Act was passed. And then we'll jump into kind of the meat of the presentation real quick. So we're gonna jump in our time machine. We're gonna go back to 1974. How many of you were alive in 1974? I wasn't. I was born in 1975. So, okay. So 1974, not sure if you guys remember who the president was, but it was President Ford. He was the president of the United States in 1974. And Congress and President Ford got together and they said, you know what, we got to figure out a way to incentivize Americans to plan for their retirement so that we're not having to subsidize or pay for Americans' retirement. And they got together and they created what's called ERISA law. And ERISA law is what created all these different retirement accounts that we have today. IRAs and 401ks and 403bs and 457s and all these wonderful things. And the reason why they created those, the main reason was, like I said, to make an incentive for Americans to save for retirement accounts. Well, fast forward to today and where we're at today, how many of us are taking more out of our retirement accounts than just the required minimum distribution every year? Raise your hand if you're accelerating the distribution from your retirement account more than your R&D. Exactly, nobody. And that's not what they intended. That's not what they thought back in 1974. They thought that by creating these vehicles, you would be accelerating the distributions from these vehicles, and they would be then getting their taxes on it. And that's not what we're doing. Instead, what most of us are doing with our retirement accounts is we're stockpiling money into these things, like I say, at the tune of over $29 trillion. And we're not using them as retirement planning vehicles, but rather we're using them as estate planning vehicles. We're trying to pass on trillions of dollars to the next generation in the most tax advantageous way. And finally, Congress said, time out, not going to work like that anymore. That wasn't the intent in 1974. So we put the kibosh on that. And so in December of 2019, President Trump at the time, signed the Secure Act and put it into place. So January 1st of 2020, Secure Act is in effect, and that's the environment, the world that we're living in. So it's important that we understand, how does the Secure Act impact us? How does it impact our beneficiaries? And what are some planning opportunities that we may have at our disposal to mitigate some of these tax issues that the Secure Act may have created? So with that, we're going to share our whiteboard here, and hopefully you guys can all see it. I always cross my fingers whenever we use technology. Can everybody see this whiteboard? Just thumbs up, shake your head. Okay, perfect. My handwriting is not great. I'll just tell you that right up front. Hopefully though, as I'm talking, you'll understand what I'm writing as I write it. So let's talk about how retirement accounts work initially. So we, as the owners of our retirement accounts, we own the retirement account. A lot of the questions that we get is, well, Dave, shouldn't my trust be the owner of our retirement account? No, your trust is never, ever, under any circumstance or situation, the owner of your retirement account. The trust can be a beneficiary of your retirement account if your trust is drafted properly, but you are always the owner. And the reason why you are the owner of your retirement account is because we have to calculate something called a required minimum distribution. How many of you are taking right now an RMD every year from your IRA or 401k? Okay, most of us are that are attending. So how do they calculate your RMD? How do they figure out how much you're supposed to take from your IRA every single year? It's a division problem. It's nothing more than a division problem. What they do is they take your life expectancy, and the IRS has life expectancy tables that we look at, and they divide the value of your IRA as of December 31st of the year prior. Let's just say it's $1 million IRA as of December 31st of the year prior, and they divide that by your life expectancy number. Well, let's say I'm 80 years old or 70 years old or whatever age, and they look at the table and they say, well, for a 75-year-old, you have 10 years left to live. That's your life expectancy number. And then it's just a division problem. So if we divide 1 million by 10, how much is that, Lisa? Well, Lisa's my math person to keep me on track here so I don't mess up. So that's $100,000 that we have to take out every year. That is our RMD. Okay. And every time we take out an RMD, we have to pay what? We have to pay tax. So we don't get 100,000. We end up with something like 70,000 because Uncle Sam is going to take 30% off the top. So this goes to us, and Uncle Sam is going to take their pound of flesh, and that's IRS goes there. And that's how your RMD works. Okay. Now, with the Secure Act, did the Secure Act change anything about how to calculate your RMD? No, it did not. What the Secure Act did do is it changed the age at which you have to start taking an RMD. So by a raise of hands, how many of you turned 70 and a half prior to January 1st, 2020? Don't be bashful about your age. It's okay. Okay, so some of us have turned 70 and a half prior to January 1st, 2020. If you were 70 and a half prior to 1/1/20, then you fall under the old rule. You don't fall under secure. And that means you took your RMD when you turn 70 and a half, and you have to continue to take your RMD every year. Those of us that may have turned 70 and a half after 1/1/20, under secure, your RMD now starts at the age of 72. So you get to wait an extra, 2 years almost, and before you have to start taking your RMD. So the Secure Act changed not how we calculate the RMD, but it changed when we have to start taking our RMD. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense in that regard. The other thing the Secure Act did, which is a good thing, we're pointing out the good things right now, then we're going to kind of get to the bad things that the Secure Act did. The other good thing the Secure Act did, I'm not sure if any of you are still working part-time or whatever, but if you have earned income, let's say you're a greeter at Walmart or you work part-time somewhere, and you have earned income coming in, under the Secure Act, you can now continue to contribute to your IRA. Whereas before, prior to Secure, once you were 70 and a half, you could no longer contribute to your IRA. You could to a 401k, and other types of retirement vehicles, but an IRA you could not continue to contribute to after you had turned 70 and a half. Under Secure, you can now continue to contribute to an IRA if you're working, if you have earned income, okay? So those are really the two kind of good things that happened with the Secure Act. The bad news with the Secure Act is what we call the stretch out that we used to get prior to the Secure Act. Okay, so what do we mean by a stretch out? I'm not sure if you guys ever played with those stretch dolls, right? The Stretch Armstrong doll where you grab one arm and the other arm and we'd stretch him real far like this. Stretch, that's what we used to do with an IRA. We'd stretch it out over a really, really, really long life expectancy after the owner of the IRA died. Okay, so hypothetical. Let's say I have $1 million IRA. It's in my Charles Schwab account. And prior to Secure, once again, we're going to jump in our time machine and go back to prior to 1/1/20 when it was enacted. And I, let's say, listed on my Charles Schwab IRA, the beneficiary, I listed my granddaughter who was 5 years old. And I died. What would happen with my granddaughter in that IRA is my granddaughter would be able to stretch that IRA for her life expectancy. What's the life expectancy for a 5-year-old? You know, it's 80 some odd years. That means that IRA would continue to grow and grow and grow for 80 more years. And all that my granddaughter would have to take out every year after I died is an RMD. Well, if you take the 80-year life expectancy and divide it by 1 million, I don't know what that number is, but it's a lot less than 100,000. And that lets that IRA continue to just grow and grow and grow, income tax deferred. And that's what we used to be able to do. And it was a great estate planning vehicle. Remember, estate planning, we're concerned about how do we preserve your legacy? How do we make sure your estate continues to grow and flourish and pass as much as we possibly can on to the next generation? Well, prior to Secure, this was awesome. It was amazing. It was fantastic. And we'd utilize it all the time. Well, now under Secure, they said, nope, no more. So you don't get an 80-year life expectancy. You now get 10 years. Okay. And this now is what we're going to focus on for the next little bit. And then how do we kind of solve some of those issues that it creates? So what do we mean by 10 years? Okay. Well, in my hypothetical, now after Secure, I still have the $1 million IRA. I die after Secure. I've listed my granddaughter still, who's 5 years old, as the beneficiary of my $1 million IRA, and I've died after Secure. Now they're going to say, hey, grandkid, you don't have 80 years. You have 10 years to take out every penny of that IRA. Every single penny of it has to come out within 10 years. Well, that drastically changes the taxes and all the stuff that goes with that. And so we need to now rethink, well, how do we deal with this issue? The only people that don't fall within the 10-year time period now are 5 groups. Okay. And they're what the IRS calls eligible designated beneficiaries. If you're not an eligible designated beneficiary on the owner's IRA when the owner dies, then you're under the 10-year rule for the most part. Okay. So who are the 5 people that can still get a stretch out? Your spouse. If I list my spouse as the beneficiary of my $1 million IRA, then I die. Under the Secure Act, my wife can still stretch the IRA for the remainder of her life expectancy. She doesn't have to take it out in 10 years. She still has a stretch. So your spouse still gets a stretch. Your minor child still gets a stretch. Okay, so looking at the age of some of you and you're raising your hand, how many of you have a minor child? Not a lot of us that are on this Zoom call. Okay, so this doesn't include grandchildren, great-grandchildren, nieces, nephews. They don't fall into that category. It has to be your minor child. If it's not your minor child, they're not an eligible designated beneficiary. The third category is somebody that is disabled. Okay, they can't work, they can't provide for themselves. The fourth is someone that's chronically ill. They can't do activities of daily living, can't feed themselves, bathe themselves, transport themselves from point A to point B. The fifth and final is somebody that's less than 10 years younger than you, right? So if I list my brother, who is 5 years younger than me, he, when I die, would be able to stretch it for his remaining life expectancy. He would not be under the 10-year rule. Those are your 5. Those are the only 5 that don't have to take it within 10 years. Well, most of us on this Zoom call are going to want to leave our largest or one of our largest assets to our children. If we're single, if we're married, we're going to list our spouse first, and then we're going to list our children as the contingent beneficiaries or our grandchildren. And most of us, our children are not minors. They're over the age of 18. And so they're not going to fit within the stretch out rules. They're going to fit within the 10-year rule. Well, what does that mean then for our loved ones after we die? Well, if now I've left this $1 million IRA to my son, who's 40 years old or whatever, and I die, what is it going to do to his income tax liability? It's going to increase his income tax liability because he has to accelerate the distribution from the IRA. He has to have it all out within 10 years. Well, if my 40-year-old son is working, he's a doctor, he's a lawyer, hopefully he's not a lawyer. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but let's say he's somebody that's got a good income, making a good living, and now I've made him take this IRA out in 10 years. That's going to accelerate the distribution and increase his income tax liability, right? If he's at the 25% tax bracket when I die with his income that he's got coming in, his wife's income, and now I've given him an extra $100,000 a year from the IRA, I just jumped him from the 25% bracket maybe to the 28, 29, 30% tax bracket, which has increased his income tax liability. Well, that's not good planning. So there's that. And then on top of that, all of it has to come out within the 10-year time period. So the next question is, how do we mitigate some of these issues? What are some planning options? What are some things that we can do? The first thing is, how many of you, by raising hands, how many of you every year make a charitable distribution? You write a check to Sun Health, you write a check to your church, you pay tithes, you Humane Society, you write a check to some charitable organization every year. Okay, I'm just trying to check everybody. I'm thinking everybody probably raised their hand. And the next question is, how many of you are taking the standard deduction instead of taking an itemized deduction? A lot of us used to take an itemized deduction, but under 2017 Trump's tax reform, They increased the standard deduction to double what it was. It's over $25,000 now for the standard deduction. Most of us are probably taking the standard deduction, which means we're not itemizing our deductions. If we're not itemizing our deductions, that means that check for 10 grand I write to my church or Humane Society or Sun Health or Make-A-Wish or whoever we love and care about as a charity, we're not getting the charitable deduction anymore. We've lost that charitable deduction because we're taking the standard deduction. And we only get a charitable deduction if we're itemizing our deductions. And most of us are now taking the standard deduction. Does that make sense? Shake your head if you're following. Close your eyes if you're sleeping. Okay. So because we've lost that charitable deduction, now when we write the check to our favorite charity, we don't get the tax benefit anymore. Well, how can we get that tax benefit back? Well, there's a couple ways. Number one is you can group your charitable distributions in 1 year, right? So instead of me writing a $10,000 check every year for 3 or 4 years, maybe I write one check in 1 year for 3 years worth of charitable donations. I tell the church, I'm not going to give you $10,000 every year for the next 3 years. I'm going to instead write a check for $30,000 this year. And then I get my charitable deduction because it's more. I'm going to now itemize my deductions because it's more than the standard deduction. And I'll get that charitable deduction. And then for the next 2 years, I'm not going to write you a check because I made up for it all in 1 year. So that's one way you can still get that charitable deduction to work for you. Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. The second way you can get the tax benefit is, remember, if you're all taking an RMD already, right? If you're forced to take this required minimum distribution every year, even if you don't want it, even if you don't need it, even if it's not benefiting you financially at all, it's just increasing your income tax liability, you have to take it. If you don't take your RMD, then it's a 50% penalty. The IRS does not mess around when it comes to RMDs. You have to take it. But let's say you're saying, I don't need it. Like, I live off of Social Security. It's more than enough for me because I eat top ramen every night. And I go out to Taco Bell and get the 99-cent burrito. And I don't need the extra $100,000 from my RMD. Why do I have to take it? Well, you have to take it because there's a 50% penalty. But what can we do? We can do what's called a qualified charitable distribution, a QCD. Qualified charitable distribution. So instead of having the RMD come out to Dave Eastman, remember the 100,000 in my math problem I have to take? Instead of that 100,000 coming to me, I can tell Charles Schwab, send the 100,000 to my favorite charity, Sun Health Foundation. Do I have to send it all? No. Could I say, send 50,000 to Sun Health? Send 50,000 to me, right? I can break up the RMD to be as little or as much as I want. There are some boundaries. We cannot give more than 100,000. Okay, so that's the top limit. It's 100,000. But that's a whole lot of money we can be distributing to charities every single year. And then what happens to our income tax? What happens to our income tax is it's not reported on our income tax return as income. I shouldn't say it that way. A CPA, if he was here, would say, you said that wrong, Dave. Don't say it that way. But the point is, I'm not being taxed on that 100,000. Do I get a charitable deduction for it? No, but it's not reported as income to me because it all went to charity. So on my income tax return, I'm going to declare on my income tax return, IRS, I took the full $100,000 distribution like I'm supposed to, no 50% penalty. So then I'm going to show on the income tax return that 50,000 of the 100,000 went to Sun Health, and the other 50,000 went to me. And what I'm taxed on is the 50,000 that went to me, not the full 100,000. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's a great planning opportunity. The Secure Act did not change the QCD. Okay. So even though they increased the age, at which we have to start taking a required minimum distribution to 72 instead of 70.5, it didn't change the fact that we can still make QCDs at the age of 70.5. So we can still make a QCD if we're not 72. If we're 71, 70.5, we can still make the QCD. If we're under 70.5, we can't do the QCD. Okay, so at 70.5, you can start making your QCD. You don't have to wait to 72, is the point. Does that make sense? Okay, great planning opportunity. If you're already making a charitable donation every single year, 5,000, 10,000, and you're already taking R&Ds, the best way to fulfill your charitable donation, because of the tax environment we're in, where we're all taking the standard deduction, or most of us, the best way to do it is fulfill your charitable desires through your R&D. Otherwise, it's bad planning, because otherwise you're taking the full 100,000 to you, you're declaring all of that as income, and then you're writing the check to the charity and you're getting 0 tax deduction for that. Bad planning. Don't do it that way. So great opportunity, great tool to use. Highly, highly recommend that you do that. What's another planning opportunity that we can use? Well, if we take the traditional $1 million IRA, and if we assume that we are in the lowest income tax brackets we're going to see probably forever, because we think the income tax brackets are only going to go one way, up, because of all that's been happening with the CARES Act and the bailouts and all that's happening in the world, then it might make sense for us to convert, not to contribute, that's different, convert our traditional IRA to a Roth IRA, right? I'd much rather pay income tax at 20 cents on the dollar if I have to pay it there, versus my children when I die 5, 6, 7, 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, where I think at that time the income tax rates are going to be 40 cents on the dollar, right? So I've just saved 20 cents on the dollar by utilizing our income tax brackets where they are today, converting my $1 million traditional IRA into a Roth IRA, paying the tax now. The good news about a Roth is a Roth will continue to grow income tax free. We never pay another dollar of tax on a Roth. So now when I die, that $1 million IRA, even with a Roth, it has to come out within 10 years to my kids, but I've already paid the tax. So every dollar that comes out to my children in the 10-year time period, if it's all in Roth, how much tax do they pay? 0. There's 0 tax on a Roth. So that IRA, it's a great planning strategy. So I go back to the child that's making $300,000-$400,000 a year, and now I've just given him an IRA. He's got to take another $100,000 a year from that under the 10-year rule. Well, if it's a Roth, it's not the 100,000 coming to him. There's no tax liability on it, right? So converting to a Roth is a good opportunity. Another great planning tool to be thinking about is if you're philanthropically minded, which all of you raised your hand and said you were when I asked the question, and you're going to be leaving part of your estate to charity anyway, right? If we read your trust or your will or whatever you have, it would say, upon our death or my death, if I'm single, I want 10% of my estate to go to Sun Health or Make-A-Wish or whoever. And I have $1 million IRA as part of my estate. Well, the best way to fulfill that philanthropic desire is not by utilizing your brokerage account. It's not by utilizing your checking account or your savings account or your life insurance proceeds. The best asset, bar none, to fulfill that 10% that you wanted to go to the charity when you die is your IRA. Why? Because a charity pays how much tax? 0, as opposed to an individual. An individual, if you leave the IRA to them, that individual doesn't get $1 if they take $1 out, right? They get 70 cents. 30 cents goes to Uncle Sam our favorite beneficiary. Just kidding. So instead, what we'd want is we'd want the IRA to fulfill our 10% distribution to our favorite charity. How do we do that? On our beneficiary form with Charles Schwab, we would say we want 10% to go to Sun Health Foundation. And then when we die, Charles Schwab's going to cut a check for $100,000 out of the IRA directly to Sun Health. And how much tax was paid on the 10%? 0, right? So that's the best. It's the best instrument to use to fulfill our charitable desires. IRA is bar none best asset to use to satisfy our philanthropic desires. Hopefully some of that made sense. I know my drawing up here might be a little confusing. I'm going to open it up for questions now so that I'll give you an opportunity to ask away and maybe clarify some of this stuff if you need to clarify. So,
hey, Dave, I think Yuda has a question for you. Yuda?
I do. On the Roth, why is there a RMD in the first place? Because the IRS is not benefiting.
okay, so the question that Judah asked, if I understand it right, is Dave, when you talk about a Roth IRA, why is there an RMD on a Roth?
Right.
Do I understand that right?
Correct.
There is no RMD on a Roth. Okay, so what I said, the difference is RMD is when I'm alive, I have to take a required minimum distribution. If I have $1 million Roth, there is no RMD for me.
Okay.
But when I die,
Right.
when I, the owner, dies, that Roth has to come out and be distributed to the beneficiaries still within 10 years.
Even though there's no tax.
Correct.
Wow. I didn't know that. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Good question. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, Yuda, great question. Anyone else have a question? This is a lot, Dave. I always learn when I hear you talk about these things. It's very, very helpful.
Yes.
Carla, did you have any questions? And I see that Sharon Granbaugh was on the call earlier. I'm not sure she still is, but yeah, either one of you with your account. Oh, Sandy has a question. Sandy Stevenson.
Yes, I get these little vignettes through the internet saying, you know, this administration might be taxing the whole IRA for their tax purposes to give. So I was wondering, what ramifications do you know of in the future for this type of thing?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Sandy. So I'm gonna take your question. I'm gonna expand it a little bit. Is that okay?
Sure.
So maybe the question, we could rephrase it as, Dave, I've heard a lot about this Build Back Better America Act that they're trying to pass. I've seen all the ads, Krista Cinema, all the wonderful things. What are they trying to do here with this? And how are they going to raise the trillions of dollars they need to do the infrastructure that they're trying to do? So have any of you been to a sausage making factory?
Yes.
Okay, who said yes?
Yuda.
Judah. Okay. So what goes into the sausage making machine and what comes out of the sausage making machine are two kind of totally different things, right?
That's correct. Yes, my husband had a factory.
Yeah, and that's basically what's happening right now with this Build Back Better America bill they're trying to get passed. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically everything that Biden and most of the Democrats wanted to do and what they put in this bill when it was initially proposed way back in September, and then it made its way through what's called the Ways and Means Committee in the House, and it made its way out of the Ways and Means Committee. So it's like a piece, it's like sausage, right? It's coming from here, it's going through this process, and now it's been spit out the other end. It is totally different, and it looks totally different than what it went in as. And what they've done, a lot of what you've heard, you've read on the internet, it was talking about your IRAs, and they're going to blow up IRAs. You have to accelerate the distribution from your IRA while you're alive, and they're going to decrease, they're going to increase the tax brackets and pay more tax, and they're going to decrease the federal state tax exemption amount and all this stuff, right? Well, as of 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, all of that stuff has been stripped out. And so none of that is part of the Build Back Better America plan anymore. Tax rates under the current bill that's sitting there are going to stay the same as they were under Trump. The federal state tax exemption amount is going to stay the same as it was under Trump. IRA stuff that they were planning on doing, that's all been stripped out. They're not going to touch those or deal with those. A lot of the grantor trust rules that they were planning on changing and altering and affecting, they've stripped all that out of the bill. So right now, the sausage looks like all that stuff's going to be out of it, right? But I will say this. History has not been kind when we look at how these bills are inevitably signed. And a good example of that is the Secure Act. The Secure Act, it's almost a 1,000-page document. So if you want really fun weekend reading, just pull that thing up and make your way through it. But what ended up happening with the Secure Act is the same exact thing that's happening with the Build Back Better Act. They had all these proposals and things that they had initially thought of. They stripped it all out. But when it got signed on the 20th of December 2019, all of it was put back in at the last minute. And it became part of the Secure Act. So it may very well be that they're going to throw all this stuff in at the very end, and you're going to see it be put back in. But right now, to answer your question, there is no change in regards to IRAs in the Build Back Better Act. There's no change in the federal state tax exemption amount. All of that right now looks like it's going to stay the same.
Okay.
How can they add it back in if the Ways and Means said no and it was taken out? Who determines that?
I don't know. It's the same as watching sausage be made. Some guy just jumps on the ladder and throws another piece of meat in, and it gets part of the sausage process. But Congress, they'll go back in, they'll renegotiate before it gets signed. Biden will say, I'm not signing it. We need to get this stuff put back in it. Last minute, they negotiate and put it in. Everybody in Congress is lobbying for something, right? And they're all holding out for something. Well, I'm not going to sign it unless I get this, and you're not going to do that unless you rub my back. And they're waiting and they're leveraging and they're trying to use their weight to do that. And at the last minute, then they concede and they say, okay, well, we'll do that for you. And if you agree to put that back in, that's just the process that we have. It's sad but true.
So there could be rules about the Roth IRA being taxed as well in the future.
There very well could be.
Yikes.
What?
They've talked about that for a long time. As a matter of fact, they talked about this 10-year rule for many, many, many years, and everyone thought there's no way they're going to do that. There's no way they're going to do that. And then December 2019, sure enough, it pops up and it's there. They've been talking about taxing Roth IRAs for a while and getting rid of all the advantages of Roth, and you're hearing speculation and stuff. And so I would not be surprised if at some point in time they change or alter some of that. But right now, that's we're living with the laws that we have, and that's what we have right now.
Hey, Dave, I think Jim Greenwald has a question. He's got his thumbs up there on the paddle. Jim?
I have a question for you, and I think Gina and Pamela will both be interested in the answer. And I would assume now, when I'm a year older from last year, from my RMD from last year, it's going to be less this year. I haven't taken anything out of the IRA over the year. Is it going to be less this year than it was last year?
Your RMD is based off of your life expectancy. So your life expectancy tables are going to constantly be going up. They're going to basically assume that you're never going to die with those life expectancy tables. And it depends on the value of your IRA. So if your IRA does extremely well this year and your life expectancy number doesn't change, and they change the tables every year, but It may or may not. I don't know. What's the value of your IRA as of December 31st? Is it worth more? Is it less? Is the market dropped? Is it increased?
Well, in this case, it's increased. Let's say the RMD last year was somewhere around 70,000. And if my IRA has gone up in value, which it has because of the market,
Then your RMD would increase.
the RMD will increase. All right. Well, I think Gina and Pam will be happy to hear that one.
Well, we're all happy to hear that. That just means that
Yes,
you
we are. Thank you,
and
Jim.
contributed more and everyone's happy. So
Good.
I-
Hey, did you have another question? Yeah.
I opted out last year. I did not take the RMD because we didn't have to. Is there an adjustment? Are they going to play catch up or are they going to increase this? I didn't receive my check yet for this year. So do you know?
no, it's a good question. So last year we didn't have to take an RMD because the CARES Act was passed. And the CARES Act basically said no RMD for this year because of COVID and all the craziness that was happening. But they did not say that for this year. So that you should be taking an RMD for this year, and that needs to come out before the end of the year.
I know, but they shorted themselves last year. Are they going to play catch
No.
up with me?
No, there's no
Okay.
catch up. There's no making up for it. You don't have to take double this year because you didn't take any last year. They just said last year it's a windfall. Nobody has to take their RMD. There's no makeup for it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, any other questions? I do have a comment, Dave, that I would like to present to you. I was in a presentation earlier this week about charitable remainder unit trust and charitable gift annuities, and of course, RMDs and IRAs. And the presenter shared something with us that I had not heard before. He said there is a 90-90-90 thing going on right now, that 90% of people who are 90 years old still have 90% of their funds in the IRA. So 90% of people who are 90 years old still have 90% of their IRA. Isn't that interesting? So clearly this message hasn't been shared. I mean, it's important for people to understand the implications of that.
Yeah, like I say, most Americans, if not the largest asset, one of the largest assets is their IRA. It's just, and the fact that they're 90 years old, 90% is still stuck in their IRA, it doesn't shock me, doesn't surprise me. It's fantastic. But a good point that you're raising there, Gina, is another vehicle you can use to mitigate some of these tax issues on the back end is a charitable remainder trust. So what happens with the charitable remainder trust, real quick, is you name the beneficiary of your IRA, the charity. When you die, the IRA goes to the charity. Charity's basically going to liquidate the IRA. They don't want to stick it in an IRA. They'll invest that money. They'll get a rate of return on that money. During the remainder of your beneficiary's life, your beneficiary is going to get a stream of income, or for a term of years or life expectancy. And then once the beneficiary dies, what's left in the fund will then go to the charity that you've named. And that's another way of solving some of the tax issues that you have. Good point.
Okay. I have another question if you have
Okay,
time.
Sandy, you bet, Sandy, go right ahead.
Okay. In an inherited IRA where they have to take it over 10 years, can they take it all can they wait for it to grow for 10 years and then take it out in the last year?
Good question. We get that question a lot as well. So once I die and I've left my IRA to my son, Johnny, and he gets the $1 million IRA, he knows he has to take it in 10 years, but can he take a little bit every year for 10 years? Can he wait till year 10 and take it all then? How does it work? There's no longer a required minimum distribution for an inherited IRA like there used to be. That's gone. So basically what it's saying is that, Johnny, my son, you have 10 years to take everything out of that IRA. You can take a little bit each year if you want. You can take it all in year 5. You can take it all in year 1. You can take it all in year 10. They don't care as long as it's all out within 10 years.
Interesting. Yeah. So Dave, thanks so much for keeping us updated on all of this. You know, these are things I love to learn and talk about, and you're always so up to speed on things. And I think our guests today have learned a lot as well. And many thanks to everybody on the call who has dialed in and who's had these great questions for this conversation about these things. So, you know, it warms my heart to look at the screen, and I'm blessed to be around some of the most generous people I've ever met in my life. And so we continue to thank you for all that. Just as you know, the Sun Health Foundation has been working in this area of philanthropy for more than 50 years, and it's what really has provided superior health care in our communities. So we continue to thank you for your support. We continue to be grateful at this time of thankfulness with Thanksgiving and count our blessings. And I count all of you among my blessings. So thank you for that. I think there's a slide next to show some of our upcoming coffees, our future coffees with Gina and Friends. So in December, Sharon Lind, the CEO of the Boswell and Webb hospitals, will be talking about what's new at your community hospitals. And of course, right now they're still on code red. We can't get into the hospitals to share the donor wall with you or any of that because things are surging again and they're being very, very careful. But Sharon will give updates on what the future of healthcare could look like, certainly in the world of healthcare, but also at our 2 hospitals. And then in January, Tony Yee, our Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at Sun Health, comes with tremendous experience in the areas of protecting your identity. That's really, really important. And so he'll have a great presentation in January. In February, Dr. Rawal from Cardiac Solutions will be talking about heart health and the beat goes on. I think that's a cool title. In March, we're going to have, that's colorectal month. So we'll have a gastroenterologist, speaking to the group. That will be the March presentation, and you'll be getting the date on that very shortly. And then in April, we'll have a presentation on women's health, and we kind of poked fun at this one. What happens when you cough? It depends. So we kind of poked fun at this one. So I hope you enjoyed that humor as much as we did. So we appreciate your continued loyalty to dialing in and educating yourselves on all of these topics. We would love to, oh, there's Winston. Hi, Winston. We would love to hear back from everyone. Other thoughts of things you might like to hear. Somebody suggested one time they wanted to hear about neuropathy, and we're looking for a physician to come in and talk about neuropathy. So please, please continue to share your ideas with us. It really makes this a very robust educational opportunity. As Thanksgiving approaches, all of us at Sun Health Foundation wish to share our gratitude to all of you for your support, for your participation, for your loyalty, and for being part of the Sun Health family. Thank you very much. So we hope that you continue to stay well. We hope that you continue to stay safe, and we hope you stay connected. Wishing you a happy Thanksgiving to everybody, and we're a few minutes early, so we'll give you the gift of time. Thanks so much to everybody. Bye-bye.